afternoon sun cast long, drowsy shadows across the emerald lawns of Maplewood Hall, where the annual summer fete unfolded with all the gentle ceremony of a village tradition that had weathered 2 wars and countless seasons of change. Miss Jane Marple, seated comfortably beneath the spreading branches of an ancient oak, worked steadily at her knitting while observing the familiar tableau with the quiet satisfaction of someone who understood that human nature, like the patterns in her wool, revealed itself most clearly through careful attention to detail. The great Georgian house presided over the festivities with benevolent dignity, its honey-colored stone warmed by the late June sunshine. Bunting fluttered between the trees in patriotic splendor, and the gentle sounds of a brass band mingled with the cheerful chatter of villagers who had turned out in their summer best for the occasion. The White Elephant stall groaned under the weight of well-intentioned donations, while the jam and preserve table displayed an impressive array of Mrs. Bantry's legendary offerings, each jar labeled in her distinctive, enthusiastic handwriting. What made this year's fete particularly noteworthy was not merely its usual charm, but the presence of its new hostess. Miss Beatrice Latham, the recently acknowledged heiress of Maplewood Hall, moved among her guests with a grace that seemed both natural and carefully cultivated. At 28, she possessed the kind of understated beauty that improved upon acquaintance. Soft brown hair arranged simply, intelligent gray eyes, and a manner that suggested genuine interest in others' welfare. She had inherited the estate just 8 months prior from her great-aunt, Lady Margaret Latham, a formidable woman whose death had surprised no one more than Beatrice herself. Miss Marple's practiced eye noted the subtle currents of tension that flowed beneath the afternoon's pleasant surface. There was something in the way Beatrice's smile flickered when she spoke to certain guests, a tightness around her eyes that suggested the weight of her new responsibilities pressed more heavily than she cared to admit. The inheritance had not been without its complications, as Miss Marple had learned through the reliable network of village gossip that kept St. Mary Mead remarkably well informed about its neighbors' affairs. Standing near the rose garden, deep in conversation with Beatrice, was Captain James Whitmore, a distinguished man in his early 40s, whose military bearing and steady gray eyes had made quite an impression since his arrival in the village 3 months ago. He served as the estate's new manager, brought in to help Beatrice navigate the complexities of her inheritance. There was nothing improper in their relationship, of course, but Miss Marple had observed the way their conversations lingered a moment too long, the careful distance they maintained that spoke of an attraction both were determined to keep, strictly professional. Less subtly positioned near the cucumber sandwiches was Mr. Lionel Pembroke, Beatrice's cousin, and the man who had, until Lady Margaret's will was read, confidently expected to inherit Maplewood Hall himself. At 35, Lionel possessed the kind of handsome features that had undoubtedly served him well in London society, but Miss Marple detected something brittle in his charm, a quality she had learned to associate with men who had lived beyond their means for too long. His presence at the fete was a masterpiece of gracious defeat, though she noticed he consumed rather more champagne than was strictly necessary for a summer afternoon. Mrs. Dorothy Finch, Beatrice's recently appointed companion, hovered nearby with the anxious efficiency of someone perpetually concerned that disaster might strike at any moment. A widow in her 50s, she had come highly recommended from an agency in London, though Miss Marple had observed that her references seemed almost too perfect, her background just a shade too vague for complete comfort. The afternoon progressed with the gentle rhythm of such events, punctuated by the drawing of raffles and the judging of flower arrangements. Miss Marple found herself drawn into conversation with Dr. Haydock about the declining art of proper rose cultivation, when she noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere near the house. Beatrice had excused herself from a group of admirers and was walking swiftly toward the French doors that led to the morning room, her composure intact, but her pace suggesting urgency. "Captain Whitmore," Miss Marple observed, watched Beatrice's retreat with an expression that mixed professional concern with something more personal. Lionel Pembroke, she noted with interest, had also noticed his cousin's departure and was making his own casual way toward the house, though by a different route that would take him through the conservatory. It was Mrs. Finch who first raised the alarm, her voice cutting through the gentle hum of conversation with uncharacteristic sharpness. "Has anyone seen Miss Latham? She was to present the prizes for the children's races at 4:00. The clock on the stable block showed 10 minutes past the hour. A ripple of mild concern passed through the assembled guests as heads turned and conversations paused. Captain Whitmore stepped forward with quiet authority. "I'll check the house," he said, his military training evident in the calm efficiency of his response. She mentioned wanting to fetch something from the library. But when he returned a few minutes later, his composed expression had given way to something approaching alarm. "She's not in any of the main rooms," he reported. "Her bedroom door is locked, and she doesn't answer when I call." Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate care. In her considerable experience, when young women of good family suddenly disappeared from their own garden parties, the explanation was rarely innocent. She rose from her chair with the unhurried movement of someone who had learned that haste often obscured more than it revealed. The search that followed had the organized chaos of a military operation conducted by well-meaning civilians. Guests fanned out across the grounds while Dr. Haydock was summoned from his examination of the prize-winning delphiniums. It was young Tommy Fletcher, the gardener's boy, who made the discovery that transformed a missing hostess into something far more sinister. In the old summer house, half hidden by overgrown ivy and rarely used except for storing garden tools, Tommy found Beatrice's silk scarf, the pale blue one she had worn knotted at her throat, lying crumpled on the dusty floor. But it was what lay beside it that caused his voice to crack as he called for help. A small pool of what was unmistakably blood, dark against the weathered wooden boards. Miss Marple arrived at the summer house as Dr. Haydock completed his preliminary examination. The scarf showed signs of having been torn, and the blood, while not extensive, was certainly fresh. More disturbing still was the complete absence of any other trace of Beatrice herself. "Well," said Colonel Melchett, who had appointed himself coordinator of the search, "this puts a rather different complexion on things." Miss Marple said nothing, but her faded blue eyes took in every detail of the scene with the methodical attention she might have given to a particularly complex knitting pattern. She noted the way the blood had pooled, suggesting Beatrice had been stationary when injured. She observed that the scarf bore no bloodstains, indicating it had been removed before whatever had caused the bleeding occurred. Most significantly, she noticed the faint but distinct impression in the dust near the door, the outline of a man's shoe, larger than any footprint Beatrice might have made. As the afternoon shadows lengthened and the cheerful sounds of the fete gave way to urgent whispers and worried speculation, Miss Marple reflected that she had once again encountered that most dangerous of combinations. A young woman with property, a family with secrets, and the kind of polite society gathering where everyone was exactly where they appeared to be, until suddenly they were not. The mystery of Maplewood Hall had begun, and Miss Marple settled her knitting bag more securely on her arm, preparing for what she suspected would be a most illuminating investigation into the darker corners of human nature. The discovery of blood in the summer house transformed the gentle afternoon gathering into something altogether more sinister, and by evening the lawns of Maplewood Hall lay strewn with abandoned teacups and trampled bunting, resembling a stage from which the players had forgotten their lines. Mrs. Finch had taken charge of shepherding the remaining guests with efficient authority, though her hands trembled as she directed the ladies toward the drawing-room, and Miss Marple noted with interest how the woman had taken care to lock Beatrice's bedroom door and pocket the key, claiming it was to preserve evidence. Captain Whitmore stood beside Dr. Haydock with military composure, organizing searches with quiet determination, but his eyes kept returning to the blood-stained floorboards with an expression that suggested personal anguish rather than mere professional concern. and Miss Marple observed that he seemed remarkably familiar with the house's layout for someone so recently employed. Most theatrical of all was Lionel Pembroke's reaction, which struck Miss Marple as curiously elaborate in its display of shocked dismay, complete with loosened collar and repeated exclamations about contacting authorities. Though she noticed he had positioned himself strategically near the telephone in the hall, and his subsequent conversation with the police seemed remarkably brief for such urgent circumstances. The arrival of Inspector Slack from the county police brought welcome official authority to the proceedings, though Miss Marple had encountered the inspector before and found his tendency toward hasty conclusions somewhat troubling. And true to form, he quickly declared that people did not simply evaporate from locked rooms, focusing immediately on the theory of robbery gone wrong by someone familiar with the estate's timing. Dr. Haydock's examination revealed that the blood was definitely human and appeared fresh, probably no more than an hour old, with the quantity suggesting significant injury, though not necessarily fatal. But the complete absence of any trail leading from the summer house was deeply troubling, implying either that Beatrice had been carried away or that her injury had occurred elsewhere entirely. When it was discovered that Beatrice's jewelry box showed signs of hasty searching, though Mrs. Finch insisted nothing of significant value appeared missing, Inspector Slack's robbery theory gained momentum, though Miss Marple remained unconvinced by explanations that seemed just plausible, enough to avoid immediate suspicion while remaining conveniently difficult to verify. Young Tommy Fletcher, whose discovery had made him suddenly important, recounted to anyone who would listen how he had gone to the summer house for a rake and found the scarf, adding that the ivy had rustled just before he called out, which at the time seemed merely wind, but now felt very much like someone moving through the shrubbery. And when Miss Marple asked with gentle interest whether the rake had been in its usual place, Tommy declared that the tools were muddled and the short fork leaned the wrong way round, which Mr. Garth never permitted. The butler, Graves, mentioned in passing that Miss Latham had received a visitor that morning, a well-dressed gentleman who had asked specifically not to be announced to other guests and had spent perhaps 20 minutes with her in the morning room before departing through the garden. Though, when pressed for details, Graves could only say the man was unfamiliar and had seemed nervous. Alice, one of the housemaids with red eyes and stubborn chin, confided that Beatrice had written letters that afternoon using blue notepaper and had given her one to post, though Alice, delayed by the flower show, had slipped it into the post bag at 3:30 instead of earlier, which might matter more than expected. By the following morning, news of the disappearance had spread through St. Mary Mead like wildfire, transforming breakfast conversations and garden fence gossip into elaborate theories about kidnapping, elopement, and family vengeance, with Mrs. Bantry arriving at Miss Marple's cottage before 10 to breathlessly report that some suspected Captain Whitmore's excessive attentiveness, while others whispered about Lionel Pembroke's obvious financial motives. The postman swore he had seen a suspicious motor car speeding from Maplewood Hall Lane, a detail that grew more elaborate with each retelling, while Miss Hartnell darkly suggested that Beatrice's modern independence had finally caught up with her, and even Dr. Haydock admitted the circumstances were most irregular when pressed by the village's amateur investigators. Cook, who had served Lady Margaret for 30 years, confided that she had never quite warmed to the new mistress, finding her too secretive, while Betty, the housemaid, whispered that Miss Latham had seemed increasingly nervous lately, starting at unexpected sounds and asking odd questions about the house's history. Miss Marple listened to these various accounts with clinical detachment, her mind sifting through layers of emotion, self-interest, and genuine confusion, understanding that in villages like St. Mary Mead, every comment and gesture was a potential clue to the intricate web of relationships and hidden motives that always lay beneath such tragedies. She positioned herself strategically where she could observe comings and goings, while maintaining the appearance of a concerned but helpless elderly lady. Noting how Captain Whitmore now spoke with defensive precision about Beatrice's recent stress and financial worries, how Lionel had regained his swagger while presenting himself as the heartbroken cousin, and how Mrs. Finch offered seemingly insignificant details about Beatrice's habits that subtly deflected suspicion from herself. The theories multiplied with each conversation, yet Miss Marple knew that the truth would be found not in random criminal activity, but in the ordinary failings and desires of ordinary people, rooted in the complex motivations surrounding the inheritance of Maplewood Hall, where each primary suspect had been conveniently absent during the crucial half-hour when Beatrice disappeared, and where the morning visitor, the locked door, and the carefully varied reactions all suggested deception rather than chance. The morning after Beatrice's disappearance brought Inspector Slack to Maplewood Hall with the determined efficiency of a man who believed that mysteries, like military campaigns, yielded to systematic pressure and thorough documentation, and he established his temporary headquarters in the library with an array of official forms, witness statements, and the confident assumption that missing heiresses were generally found through conventional police work rather than village gossip. Miss Marple, arriving with Mrs. Bantry under the charitable pretext of offering assistance to the bereaved household, positioned herself strategically in the morning room where her knitting needles could click peacefully, while her ears performed their more essential function of gathering the threads that Inspector Slack's direct approach might overlook, and she observed with interest how each member of the household responded to official scrutiny with performances that seemed both rehearsed and somehow inadequate to the gravity of the situation. Captain Whitmore submitted to questioning with military precision, detailing his movements on the afternoon of the fete with a kind of methodical accuracy that spoke of a man accustomed to accountability. Yet Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his voice when he described searching for Beatrice, and the way his eyes drifted toward the French doors as if he could still see her moving across the lawn in her pale dress, while his intimate knowledge of the house's layout, which keys opened which doors, which passages led where, seemed remarkably comprehensive for someone employed only 3 months. Mrs. Finch presented herself as the model of anxious propriety, her small hands clasped tightly as she detailed Beatrice's recent troubles with what appeared to be genuine concern. Yet Miss Marple observed how the companion's efficiency in managing the household during the crisis carried an almost proprietorial quality, and when Mrs. Finch mentioned, almost casually, that Beatrice had been receiving anonymous letters recently, nothing threatening exactly, but unsettling enough to require screening, her explanation that these letters had been destroyed at Beatrice's request seemed conveniently complete, leaving no evidence for official examination. Lionel Pembroke's interview revealed a man walking the delicate line between appropriate family concern and suspicious eagerness to be helpful, his charm polished but somehow brittle as he detailed his movements during the crucial half-hour, claiming to have been examining botanical specimens in the conservatory at Beatrice's specific request, though when pressed for details about which plants had required such urgent attention, his answers became vague in the way of someone who had prepared a story without considering its supporting details. Miss Marple found it particularly interesting that Lionel mentioned, with apparent candor, that Beatrice had recently consulted him about changing her will, ostensibly to make better provisions for the estate staff, but possibly involving other beneficiaries, a conversation he claimed had taken place just 2 weeks prior during one of his regular visits, though his vagueness about the specific nature of Beatrice's concerns suggested either faulty memory or deliberate omission, and she noted how his eyes catalogued the room's valuable contents, even as he spoke of family loyalty and shared grief. The household staff provided their own layers of revelation and concealment, with Graves, the butler, maintaining his formal composure while repeating his account of the mysterious morning visitor with a consistency that struck Miss Marple as almost too perfect, devoid of the usual human uncertainties that accompanied genuine recollection, though his description of the well-dressed, nervous gentleman who had declined refreshment and departed through the garden remained frustratingly generic. Alice, the housemaid, still flustered about her delayed posting of Beatrice's letter, revealed under gentle questioning that the correspondence had been addressed to a London solicitor rather than the local firm that handled estate business, and that the envelope had felt unusually thick, suggesting contents beyond ordinary correspondence, while Beatrice's instruction to post it immediately and her comment about finalizing arrangements took on more sinister implications in light of subsequent events. Dr. Haydock's medical examination of the scene provided disturbing professional insights that challenged Inspector Slack's straightforward theories, revealing that the blood pattern in the summer house suggested someone who had been standing or sitting rather than struggling violently, with evidence of hasty but incomplete cleaning that spoke of panic rather than premeditation, and his private revelation that Beatrice had consulted him several weeks earlier about persistent headaches and difficulty sleeping, symptoms she attributed to the stress of her inheritance but which might have had other causes, added another layer of complexity, particularly when he mentioned her specific questions about certain medications and whether they might leave detectable traces in the system. Miss Marple's own examination of the summer house, conducted with the unhurried thoroughness that Inspector Slack's official searchers had lacked, revealed details that painted a more complex picture than simple abduction. The faint but persistent scent of violet that lingered beneath stronger odors of earth and ivy, the narrow strip of clean wood on the far bench where dust did not lie, suggesting a book or package had rested there recently, and most intriguingly, the small hatpin dropped near the bench, ordinary enough to escape official notice but significant to someone who understood that ladies of Beatrice's social standing did not venture into dusty outbuildings without securing their appearance. The morning room itself yielded additional clues to the observant eye, including a tea service set for 2 rather than 1, with the faintest crescent of lipstick on a rim that suggested a cooler shade than Beatrice typically wore, and beside the tray a small heap of ash, pale and fine, not the coarse remains of Captain Whitmore's cigarettes, but the powdery residue of Turkish tobacco that certain types of gentlemen affected, while the careful arrangement of papers on the writing desk suggested someone had searched through them with practiced discretion rather than desperate haste. As the day progressed, and Inspector Slack's systematic searches of the grounds yielded nothing more substantial than muddy boots and frustrated constables, Miss Marple reflected that the truth of Beatrice's disappearance lay not in external threats or random violence, but in the intricate web of relationships, obligations, and desires that bound the residents of Maplewood Hall together in ways that made desperate action seem almost inevitable, with each principal player harboring secrets that might provide motive for the kind of careful planning that left bloodstains without bodies, anonymous letters without evidence, and a household where everyone performed their grief and concern with just enough authenticity to deflect suspicion while concealing the darker truths that had been building toward this crisis through weeks of mounting pressure, anonymous threats, legal consultations, and the kind of intimate betrayals that flourished in the hothouse atmosphere of inherited wealth and family resentment, where the difference between victim and villain often depended on timing, opportunity, and the fatal human tendency to believe that desperate problems required desperate solutions. By the second evening, Inspector Slack had done what he always did when public pressure demanded swift action and his superiors required visible progress. He produced a suspect with the kind of methodical certainty that impressed constables and satisfied magistrates, even when it failed to convince those who understood that human nature rarely yielded to such convenient solutions. Captain Whitmore's arrest came with all the ceremony of official vindication, based on what Slack considered an overwhelming accumulation of circumstantial evidence that painted the military man as a calculating predator who had used his position of trust to pursue an increasingly desperate romantic obsession with his employer. The discovery of nearly £200 in crisp banknotes hidden in Whitmore's modest cottage, along with what appeared to be a love letter in Beatrice's distinctive handwriting, provided the concrete proof that Slack's investigation had been seeking, though Miss Marple found herself troubled by the very convenience of these revelations, particularly the letter which, while certainly authentic, contained expressions of gratitude that seemed curiously formal for genuine romantic correspondence, reading more like careful composition designed to create evidence than the spontaneous outpouring of a woman in love. The money itself struck her as suspiciously clean and sequential, suggesting recent bank withdrawal rather than the accumulated savings of a man living modestly on his estate manager's salary, and Whitmore's explanation that the funds represented military service savings seemed plausible enough until one considered that his cottage contained no other signs of the comfortable lifestyle such resources would have provided. Miss Marple observed with particular interest how the household reacted to Whitmore's arrest, noting that Mrs. Finch's shock seemed tempered by an unmistakable relief that she quickly covered with renewed anxiety about managing the estate during this crisis, while Lionel Pembroke's theatrical expressions of disbelief and family loyalty struck her as performances designed more for public consumption than private conviction, particularly his immediate offer to post bail and his insistence that such an honorable military man could never commit such a crime. The village itself divided along predictable lines, with the men at the Blue Boar declaring that desperate love made fools of the best soldiers, while the ladies at the post office agreed with suspicious unanimity that quiet, trustworthy types were often the most dangerous, bringing up examples from their collective memory with the practiced ease of women who had spent lifetimes cataloguing masculine failings and their inevitable consequences. Miss Marple's own investigation of the summer house, conducted with the unhurried thoroughness that official searchers invariably lacked, revealed details that painted a more complex picture than simple romantic obsession turned violent, beginning with the persistent scent of Parma violets that lingered beneath stronger odors of earth and ivy, a fragrance that belonged neither to Beatrice's light rose water nor to Mrs. Finch's claimed preference for no perfume at all. Yet when the companion bent over tea trays, Miss Marple had detected that same powdery sweetness that spoke of sachets and careful economy rather than expensive bottles. The small hat pin she had quietly retrieved from near the blood-stained bench proved equally intriguing upon closer examination, its delicate silver filigree work bearing a tiny mother-of-pearl bead with a distinctive crescent chip, and when she later observed Mrs. Finch's hat stand, she noted 2 pins with jet heads and one with an identical pearl bead bearing the same moon-shaped imperfection, though the companion's collection now numbered only 2 pins where it had previously held 3. A discrepancy that Mrs. Finch explained with flustered references to carelessness and the difficulty of keeping track of small accessories during such distressing times. Dr. Haydock's private revelation that the blood pattern suggested a nosebleed or blow to the mouth rather than serious injury, combined with evidence of hasty cleaning using coarse cloth rather than proper towels, pointed toward panic and concealment rather than premeditated violence, while the discovery that several keys throughout the old house operated multiple locks due to architectural economy meant that Mrs. Finch's careful possession of Beatrice's bedroom key might have provided access to other rooms as well, including the morning room where the mysterious visitor had conducted his business. The evening brought additional revelations when young Tommy Fletcher, whose adventurous spirit had already contributed one crucial discovery, found evidence of a recent fire in the old boathouse where no flames had been lit in months, and his excited report sent Inspector Slack and Dr. Haydock hurrying to the lake with the grim satisfaction of men who preferred tangible evidence to psychological speculation, though what they found raised more questions than it answered about the nature of Beatrice's disappearance and the identity of those responsible for the increasingly elaborate deception that seemed to surround every aspect of the case. The charred remains in the boathouse stove, carefully extracted with tweezers and spread upon a wooden plank for examination, revealed fragments of blue notepaper identical to Beatrice's personal stationery, along with the corner of an envelope bearing the partial impression of a London legal firm whose name emerged as Ham and Y through the stubborn visibility that ash sometimes preserved where fire had failed to complete its work. More significant still was the lingering odor beneath the soot, a ghost of Turkish tobacco mingled with that same sweet violet fragrance that had haunted the summer house, suggesting that whoever had burned these papers had carried both scents with them from their previous activities, creating an olfactory trail that connected the two locations in ways that official investigation had not yet recognized. Inspector Slack declared triumphantly that someone had destroyed evidence under cover of darkness, making the case look increasingly like blackmail gone wrong, though Miss Marple reflected that people who burned papers in panic rarely chose locations so distant from the house unless they feared discovery by those who slept within its walls, and the careful selection of the boathouse, with its isolated position and convenient stove, suggested familiarity with the estate's geography that went beyond casual knowledge. Mrs. Finch's appearance at the scene with a shawl around her narrow shoulders and an expression of horrified comprehension that settled too quickly into helpful efficiency struck Miss Marple as particularly revealing, especially when the companion recalled, as if the thought had only just occurred to her, that Beatrice had mentioned sending confidential instructions to a London solicitor on the very afternoon of the fete. Something about trust provisions that required immediate attention and absolute discretion. The household staff provided their own layers of revelation and concealment, with Alice, the housemaid, becoming hysterical under renewed questioning and blurting that Beatrice had sent her to Much Benham that morning to purchase new blue notepaper because the good pad had been promised to someone, a curious phrase that suggested advanced planning rather than spontaneous correspondence, while Cook's insistence that no cleaning cloths had gone missing from the kitchen was contradicted by Alice's tearful confession that a coarse tea towel had disappeared from the scullery basket, an absence that Mrs. Finch had noticed and scolded her about with unusual sharpness for such a minor domestic matter, creating the impression that even the smallest details of the household's operation were being monitored and controlled with an attention that went far beyond normal companion duties and suggested instead the careful management of evidence by someone who understood exactly what traces needed to be eliminated and which stories needed to be coordinated to present a convincing facade of innocent confusion and genuine grief. Morning brought fresh complications in the form of a crude ransom note slid beneath Maplewood Hall's front door during the night, written on coarse paper in what appeared to be an uneducated hand, demanding money to be left at the Folly by the Lime Avenue, with theatrical flourishes that included the misspelling of heiress as hair-s, in a manner that struck Miss Marple as almost too obviously the work of someone imitating stable-boy penmanship rather than genuine illiteracy. Inspector Slack received this development with the relief of a man whose theories had been vindicated by events, declaring that at last they faced straightforward criminal enterprise rather than the psychological complexities that had previously muddied the investigation, though Miss Marple found herself wondering why kidnappers would wait 3 days to make their demands known and why they would choose such a public location for the exchange, when the estate offered numerous isolated spots that would serve their purposes better while providing greater security from observation. The household's reaction to the ransom demand revealed the same patterns of performance and concealment that had characterized their responses to previous developments, with Captain Whitmore demanding from his cell to be allowed to deliver the money as proof of his innocence and devotion, Lionel Pembroke objecting that family interests required family representation in any negotiations, Mrs. Finch wringing her hands while somehow managing to position herself near every important conversation, and Graves requesting with stern propriety that the police handle all aspects of the matter to avoid further complications or dangers to the remaining members of the household. Miss Marple, observing these various reactions with the patient attention she might have given to a particularly complex knitting pattern, reflected that genuine ransom notes rarely appeared when investigations were closing in on the truth and that the timing of this particular demand suggested not criminal opportunism, but rather a desperate attempt to redirect official attention away from uncomfortable revelations about Violet's scents, burned papers, missing hat pins, and the increasingly obvious fact that Beatrice Latham's disappearance had been orchestrated by someone who knew her habits intimately and had access to both her personal effects and her private correspondence. Someone who had been present in the summer house when blood was shed and papers were torn, someone who had carefully cleaned the scene while leaving just enough evidence to implicate others, and someone who now found it necessary to create the illusion of outside criminal activity, to prevent the investigation from focusing too closely on the web of deception that had been carefully constructed within the seemingly innocent walls of Maplewood Hall itself. The ransom exchange at the Folly proved as empty and theatrical as Miss Marple had privately anticipated, with Inspector Slack's carefully positioned constables crouching behind ancient yews like overgrown schoolboys, playing at soldiers while the leather satchel containing marked banknotes sat untouched on the stone bench, mocking their vigil with the Gothic gargoyles that had witnessed decades of village scandals from their carved perches. The failure confirmed what Miss Marple had suspected from the note's deliberately crude spelling and theatrical demands. This was misdirection rather than genuine criminal enterprise, designed to send official investigation chasing phantoms while the real perpetrator continued operating within Maplewood Hall's seemingly innocent walls. Mrs. Finch's behavior during the vigil struck Miss Marple as particularly revealing. Her nervous energy manifesting in compulsive cleaning of already spotless rooms and frequent trips to windows, commanding views of the Folly, behavior that suggested not hospitality toward waiting officers, but rather anxious monitoring of events she had helped orchestrate. While her insistence on personally preparing tea for the constables, despite having perfectly capable kitchen staff, indicated a compulsive need to control every aspect of the household's interaction with official scrutiny. Morning brought Miss Marple to the library under the charitable pretext of admiring Lady Margaret's collection, though her true purpose involved observing the subtle currents of household life that revealed themselves to patient watchers, and she noted with interest how Graves seemed unusually distracted, his gaze frequently drifting toward particular shelves near the fireplace, where he occasionally adjusted volumes as if checking their positions. When she casually inquired about the library's organization, the normally unflappable butler became flustered, mumbling about Lady Margaret's eccentricities and general disarray, a response that struck Miss Marple as describing hidden order rather than genuine chaos, particularly when she observed that the books in question were legal volumes dealing with inheritance law and estate management, subjects that would naturally interest someone planning to challenge or circumvent existing arrangements. Her gentle persistence eventually yielded a crucial revelation when Graves, his conscience finally overwhelming his discretion, confessed that the mysterious morning visitor had indeed been a woman rather than a man, her gender concealed by a small veiled hat and deliberately androgynous clothing, and that he had lied to police on Mrs. Finch's explicit instruction to protect what the companion had termed Miss Latham's privacy during such a busy day. The visitor had presented a card from a London legal firm whose name Graves remembered as something ending in Wyndham, had taken very little tea while leaving the telltale crescent of an unfamiliar lipstick shade on her cup, and had departed through the garden carrying what might have been documents or correspondence, details that painted a picture of professional consultation rather than social call, though the woman's nervous manner and violet fragrance suggested personal stakes in whatever business had brought her to Maplewood Hall on the morning of the fete. Miss Marple's subsequent investigation of the conservatory, where Lionel claimed to have been examining botanical specimens during Beatrice's disappearance, revealed a small overturned pot containing suspicious clay residue identical to the summer house floor, and nearby, almost completely concealed beneath exotic ferns, a tarnished silver locket engraved with BL, whose broken chain suggested violent removal rather than casual loss. evidence that someone had planted Beatrice's personal effects to create a trail of clues leading investigators toward predetermined conclusions about her fate and the identity of those responsible. Cook's confidences over afternoon tea provided additional disturbing revelations about Beatrice's recent habits, particularly her sudden preference for taking breakfast alone in her room using an old ceramic teapot rather than her usual silver service. A change that Alice the housemaid tearfully admitted had been orchestrated by Mrs. Finch, who had instructed her to prepare 2 cups each morning but to add a special white powder from a discreetly labeled bottle to Beatrice's tea, claiming it was vitamin supplement for her mistress's nervous condition. This detail resonated ominously with Dr. Haydock's earlier mention of Beatrice's persistent headaches and her specific inquiries about certain medications, suggesting a systematic campaign to undermine her health and mental clarity through gradual poisoning disguised as medical care. While Mrs. Finch's position as trusted companion provided perfect cover for such intimate manipulation, allowing her to monitor Beatrice's condition and adjust dosages according to the requirements of whatever larger plan was unfolding within the household's polite routines. The mysterious morning visitor's true purpose became clearer when Miss Marple's discreet inquiries at the village tobacconist revealed that a gentleman matching the description Graves had originally provided had purchased expensive Turkish cigarettes several weeks earlier, asking pointed questions about Maplewood Hall's layout and its inhabitants' habits that suggested reconnaissance rather than casual interest, while his specific concerns about unlocked doors and Beatrice's morning routines indicated someone gathering intelligence for a carefully planned operation. Mrs. Finch's increasingly obvious deceptions, her missing hat-pin with its distinctive chipped pearl, her ink-stained fingers suggesting forged correspondence, her excessive attention to household details that should have been routine, and, most significantly, her persistent presence at every crucial moment of the investigation, painted a picture of someone orchestrating events from within while maintaining the facade of devoted service, using her position to manipulate evidence, control information, and deflect suspicion toward more obvious targets like Captain Whitmore and Lionel Pembroke, whose genuine flaws and ambitions made them perfect scapegoats for a crime that required intimate knowledge of Beatrice's habits, access to her private correspondence, and the kind of patient, methodical planning that could only be accomplished by someone who had earned complete trust through months of apparently selfless dedication to her employer's welfare, making Mrs. Finch not merely a suspect, but the architect of an elaborate deception designed to eliminate Beatrice while ensuring that blame fell elsewhere. The house itself seemed to announce the new calamity with a sudden metallic clang from the servants' passage, followed by Alice's thin scream that cut through the morning quiet like a blade through silk. And when people hurried toward the sound, they found Graves sprawled at the foot of the back stairs, a silver tray overturned beside him, and a dark tide of cocoa seeping into the grooves of ancient flagstones, while the delicate cup had rolled in a perfect arc and come to rest against the wainscoting, still rocking with a faint, rhythmic tapping that continued long after the butler's chest had gone still. Inspector Slack arrived with the brisk efficiency of a man to whom Providence had delivered yet another piece of evidence, and after a cursory examination, he pronounced that Graves had suffered either a seizure or a misstep, which amounted to much the same thing when a man reached advanced years and carried too many household worries in his head. Though Dr. Haydock's more thorough investigation revealed troubling inconsistencies that suggested accident was merely the surface of something more sinister. The physician's trained eye noted that while the neck showed damage consistent with a fall, a small but distinct bruise behind the left ear indicated a prior blow that might have left the butler dizzy and disoriented, while his fingers detected beneath the cocoa's rich aroma a faint, sweet powder that seemed neither sugar nor any spice commonly found in household kitchens, creating the disturbing possibility that Graves had been deliberately incapacitated before his fatal tumble down the narrow stairs. Miss Marple, arriving with the measured pace that experience had taught her was most effective in preserving crucial details, observed the small matters that official investigation often overlooked. How the dust on the banister had been disturbed in a neat, straight line suggesting deliberate wiping rather than the broad smear of a grasping hand. How a single spent match lay upon a step where no candle or lamp belonged, and most significantly, how the butler's keys, that heavy ring of old iron that had weighed his pocket for decades, had vanished entirely from both his person and the immediate vicinity, an absence that spoke of purpose rather than chance. Mrs. Finch materialized with remarkable swiftness, pale and tremulous in her dark dress, a woolen shawl clutched to her narrow chest as she knelt beside poor Graves with what appeared to be genuine distress, though Miss Marple noticed how the companion's eyes darted quickly over the scene as if cataloguing details rather than simply responding to tragedy. And when Mrs. Finch took the dead man's hand in apparent grief, there was something calculating in her expression that suggested she was measuring the usefulness of someone who had served the house longer than living memory could recall. Alice's hysterical account of events proved equally revealing under gentle questioning, as the girl's story shifted from claiming she had prepared the cocoa at Mrs. Finch's usual request to insisting that the companion had sent her to bed early, contradictions that painted a picture of careful coaching rather than natural confusion, while her tearful insistence that she had followed normal procedures exactly was undermined by her obvious terror at having done something terribly wrong without understanding what it might have been. The discovery of Graves' missing keys led to a systematic search that revealed disturbing evidence of tampering throughout the house, beginning with the library where Miss Marple's sharp eyes detected a thin layer of ash upon the desk. Not the coarse residue of ordinary paper, but the fine, pale powder that remained when legal documents written on expensive stock were hastily burned, while several volumes dealing with inheritance law and estate management had been shifted slightly from their usual positions, their leather spines no longer aligned with mathematical precision that had characterized Graves's meticulous care for Lady Margaret's collection. More significant still was the morning's post, which had arrived with its usual punctuality despite the household's chaos, and among the routine correspondence Inspector Slack discovered a thick, cream envelope bearing the impressive crest of Wyndham and Wycherley solicitors, addressed to Miss Beatrice Latham in formal script that conveyed both urgency and discretion, the kind of legal communication that suggested matters of considerable importance requiring immediate attention and absolute confidentiality from all parties involved. The letter's contents transformed the investigation's entire complexion, revealing that the London firm acknowledged receipt of Miss Latham's sealed instructions posted on the afternoon of the fete and currently held in their senior partner's personal safe. Pending her scheduled appearance the following Tuesday to execute certain documents of a confidential nature, while they regretted any inconvenience caused by their messenger's delayed arrival on the day in question due to railway complications that had disrupted the careful timing of what was clearly a prearranged consultation. Most significantly, the correspondence carefully avoided specifying the messenger's gender while confirming that preliminary documents had been signed by Miss Latham's authorized representative, creating the strong impression that someone other than Beatrice herself had conducted business with the legal firm under false pretenses, using forged authority to gain access to confidential information or to prevent legitimate legal proceedings from moving forward as originally planned. Inspector Slack's immediate telephone inquiry to Wyndham and Wycherley yielded additional disturbing revelations. Their messenger had indeed been instructed by letter to avoid the main entrance and conduct business through the garden door to prevent inconvenience during a social gathering, while the signature acknowledging receipt of preliminary documents bore sufficient resemblance to samples of Miss Latham's handwriting to pass casual inspection, though closer examination might reveal the subtle differences that distinguished genuine signatures from skillful forgeries created by someone with intimate access to personal correspondence and legal documents. Mrs. Finch's reaction to these discoveries provided its own layer of incriminating evidence, as her initial shock at learning of the legal firm's involvement gave way too quickly to helpful speculation about Beatrice's possible motives for such secretive arrangements, with theories about financial difficulties or romantic complications that seemed designed to deflect attention from more serious possibilities while maintaining her facade of loyal concern for her missing employer's reputation and welfare. The companion's intimate knowledge of Beatrice's business affairs, revealed through seemingly innocent comments about trust provisions and inheritance complications, suggested access to private documents that went far beyond normal household management, while her casual mention of multiple London solicitors consulting about complex legal matters painted a picture of maneuvering that might require temporary concealment to avoid family interference or unwelcome scrutiny from parties with competing interests. When Miss Marple gently inquired about the morning visitor's identity, Mrs. Finch's explanation that she had signed for documents to spare Beatrice the distraction during party preparations seemed plausible enough, until one considered that devoted companions do not typically forge their employers' signatures on legal correspondence, particularly when such documents might involve matters of inheritance, guardianship, or mental competency that could fundamentally alter the distribution of considerable wealth and property. Miss Marple requested tea to be served in the morning room because she had learned through decades of experience that domestic rituals often loosen tongues more effectively than official interrogation, and also because she wished to observe Mrs. Finch's hands under circumstances that would reveal the small betrayals of guilt and fear that announce themselves in gesture and posture long before they reach conscious speech, creating opportunities for the kind of psychological pressure that could crack even carefully maintained facades when applied with sufficient subtlety and patience. The companion arrived promptly, that faint suggestion of Violet's about her person as delicate as a whisper, settling with careful posture on the edge of a chintz chair while Miss Marple arranged cups and saucers with the unhurried precision she brought to all domestic tasks, creating an atmosphere of gentle normalcy that encouraged confidences while providing cover for the most searching psychological examination, the kind of quiet interrogation that revealed character through reaction rather than direct accusation. Miss Marple began with an apparently innocent story from St. Mary Mead concerning a colonel's niece who had mislaid important correspondence and blamed household staff, only to betray herself by remembering details that no innocent person could have known, a cautionary tale told with gentle humor, while Miss Marple's faded blue eyes watched for the invisible tensions that announced themselves in tightened fingers, controlled breathing, and the almost imperceptible flinch that accompanies recognition of uncomfortable parallels between fictional anecdotes and personal experience. When she mentioned, as if recalling a trifling detail, that poor Graves had possessed the admirable habit of keeping library books in perfect alignment so that displaced volumes would immediately announce unauthorized browsing, Mrs. Finch's hand moved unconsciously to brush at her sleeve, removing an imaginary speck of dust in the reflexive gesture of someone whose conscience carried the weight of actual disturbance among carefully ordered possessions, while her throat moved in a tight swallow that suggested difficulty maintaining the composed demeanor that had served her so well throughout the investigation's various revelations. The conversation turned, with apparent casualness, to the curious properties of certain white powders that could render a person drowsy without betraying their presence through taste or odor when mixed into thick, sweet beverages like cocoa, an observation that prompted Mrs. Finch to inquire with suspicious specificity whether Dr. Haydock had identified the particular substance found in poor Graves's cup. A question that no woman of her social training would ask unless she possessed intimate knowledge of pharmaceutical preparations and their detection, revealing familiarity with chemical methods that went far beyond the domestic expertise expected of a genteel companion. Miss Marple's gentle mention of blue notepaper and the mercy that Wyndham and Wycherley preferred cream stationery, which simplified matters for police who might otherwise have been misled by superficial similarities, caused Mrs. Finch's teacup to rattle against its saucer with crystalline precision, while her assertion that ordinary people could not distinguish between different shades of correspondence paper was true for innocent observers, but decidedly false for those engaged in deliberate misdirection through careful document substitution and forgery. The psychological pressure intensified when Miss Marple produced from her knitting bag the silver hat-pin with its distinctive mother-of-pearl bead chipped in the unmistakable shape of a crescent moon, turning it thoughtfully in the afternoon light while observing that she had always admired ladies who maintained careful inventory of their personal accessories. Unlike those careless souls who were forever leaving pins in dangerous locations where children might step on them or investigators might discover them in places where they had no legitimate reason to be. A pointed reference that caused Mrs. Finch to glance too briefly at the evidence before her eyes moved with guilty reflex toward the small leather sewing case at her belt, an accessory she had worn daily for months, but which now, significantly, was absent from her person, its omission as telling as a confession to someone trained in reading the small deceptions that betray larger crimes. The final test came with Miss Marple's seemingly innocent reference to postal procedures and the inconvenient tendency of village employees to notice unusual details like envelope thickness and make cheerful observations that spread through local networks of gossip, followed by the casual mention that Wyndham and Wycherley had expressed satisfaction with the clear, legible signature provided by Miss Latham's companion, a detail that caused Mrs. Finch's hands to form a perfect tense circle on her knees, while her fingertips whitened with pressure, and when she offered no response to this revelation, the silence itself became an active force that Miss Marple recognized as the sound of a carefully constructed defense, finally beginning to crumble under the weight of accumulated evidence and psychological pressure that had exposed the human weaknesses underlying even the most elaborate criminal conspiracy. The silence that followed Miss Marple's seemingly innocent observations about postal procedures and signature verification stretched between the two women like a taut wire, and Mrs. Finch's carefully maintained composure began to show hairline cracks that widened with each passing moment, her hands forming rigid circles on her knees, while her breathing became shallow and controlled in the manner of someone fighting against the inevitable collapse of an elaborate facade that had required months of careful construction and meticulous attention to detail. Miss Marple continued her gentle assault with the patient persistence of water wearing away stone, her voice never rising above the conversational tone appropriate for afternoon tea. Yet each carefully chosen word struck with surgical precision at the weak points in a story that had seemed so plausible when viewed from official distance but revealed its fundamental contradictions when examined through the lens of intimate household knowledge and feminine intuition about the small betrayals that announce larger crimes to those trained in reading the subtle language of guilt and desperation. When Mrs. Finch finally spoke, her voice carried the hollow quality of someone whose carefully constructed identity was dissolving before her eyes, and she began with the classic criminal's plea that events had spiraled beyond her control, that she had never intended harm to come to anyone, least of all to poor Graves, who had been nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle to plans that had seemed so reasonable when viewed through the distorting lens of desperation and long-nursed resentment against a world that had consistently denied her the security and recognition she believed her breeding and intelligence deserved. Miss Marple listened with the compassionate attention she might have given to a troubled parishioner, her knitting needles clicking softly as Mrs. Finch's story emerged in fragments, each revelation more damning than the last, beginning with the confession that her credentials as a companion were entirely fraudulent, her real identity being that of Dorothy Wainwright, a distant cousin of the Latham family whose claim to Maplewood Hall had been overlooked for generations, leaving her to survive through a series of increasingly desperate expedients that had culminated in the creation of a false identity and the patient infiltration of the household she believed should rightfully have been hers. The gradual poisoning had begun almost immediately upon her arrival, using a compound obtained through correspondence with a disreputable chemist in London who specialized in providing exotic substances to ladies with nervous conditions. The white powder carefully administered in increasing doses through Beatrice's morning tea to create a pattern of symptoms that would support claims of mental instability while gradually undermining her ability to think clearly about business matters or recognize the subtle manipulations being practiced upon her daily routine. Mrs. Finch's medical knowledge, acquired through necessity during her years of precarious independence, had enabled her to calibrate the dosage with scientific precision, creating headaches, confusion, and memory lapses that could be attributed to the stress of inheritance while leaving no permanent damage that might arouse Dr. Haydock's suspicions during routine examinations, though the physician's growing concern about Beatrice's condition had forced an acceleration of plans that ultimately led to the desperate measures taken on the afternoon of the fete. The morning visitor had indeed been Mrs. Finch herself in masculine disguise, her slight build and androgynous features lending themselves to the deception, while her forged credentials gained her access to Wyndham and Wycherley under the pretense of representing Beatrice's interests in confidential legal matters, the goal being to discover the exact terms of any new will that might threaten the existing arrangements she had been working so carefully to manipulate through her influence over Beatrice's increasingly compromised mental state. The discovery that Beatrice intended to establish a charitable trust that would effectively prevent any individual from inheriting the bulk of the estate had precipitated the crisis that led to the events of the fete, as Mrs. Finch realized that months of patient work were about to be undone by philanthropic impulses that would leave her with nothing despite her elaborate preparations and considerable personal risks. The actual confrontation in the summer house had begun as a final attempt at persuasion, with Mrs. Finch revealing her true identity and demanding that Beatrice reconsider her charitable intentions. But when Beatrice reacted with horror and threatened to summon the police immediately, the situation had escalated into physical struggle during which the hatpin had been used to strike Beatrice's nose, producing the blood that had so alarmed subsequent investigators, while the shock and existing drug effects had left her unconscious but not seriously injured. The removal of Beatrice's unconscious form had been accomplished through careful planning and intimate knowledge of the estate's hidden passages, her body transported to the old wine cellar beneath the kitchen gardens, where the thick stone walls and forgotten location provided perfect concealment, while Mrs. Finch returned to the fete with torn scarf and carefully planted blood stains. Graves's elimination had become necessary, because the old butler's intimate knowledge of household routines and his suspicious nature had led him to notice discrepancies in Mrs. Finch's behavior and to begin asking uncomfortable questions about missing keys, altered documents, and the mysterious morning visitor whose true identity he had begun to suspect through his own careful observations, making him a dangerous witness whose testimony could unravel the entire elaborate deception that had taken months to construct and implement with such careful attention to psychological manipulation, forged credentials, and patient criminal planning that had seemed so clever in conception, but had ultimately collapsed through the accumulation of small inconsistencies that sharp observation and patient investigation had finally exposed as the work of someone whose guilt had betrayed itself through the very thoroughness of her attempts at concealment and misdirection. The summons to Inspector Slack was delivered with Miss Marple's customary quiet certainty. Her request that he bring Dr. Haydock, 2 constables, and lanterns to the kitchen gardens, carrying the weight of absolute conviction that had characterized her gentle but relentless pursuit of truth throughout the investigation. Mrs. Finch sat with the deflated posture of someone whose elaborate deception had finally collapsed under patient questioning, her hands trembling not with remorse but with the frustrated rage of a plan that had seemed perfect in conception, yet had been undone by the kind of minute observations that official investigation typically overlooked in favor of more dramatic evidence. The descent into the wine cellar required careful navigation of stone steps, worn smooth by centuries of use, their flickering lantern light revealing cobwebs thick as curtains in the musty atmosphere of neglect that had preserved the underground chambers in medieval darkness, while Mrs. Finch led the way with reluctant cooperation that served as final confirmation of her intimate knowledge of Maplewood Hall's hidden geography. They found Beatrice in the furthest chamber, beyond bins of mildewed bottles and forgotten storage racks, lying on a makeshift pallet that spoke of systematic planning rather than desperate improvisation, her condition suggesting careful attention to preserving life while preventing escape or communication with potential rescuers. Dr. Haydock's immediate examination revealed dehydration and the lingering effects of chemical sedation, but his professional assessment that she would recover completely brought visible relief to the rescue party, while Mrs. Finch's expression suggested disappointment rather than satisfaction at this fortunate outcome, confirming Miss Marple's suspicion that the original plan had involved eventual murder disguised as tragic medical emergency. The physical evidence surrounding Beatrice's imprisonment painted a disturbing picture of calculated cruelty, with provisions for long-term confinement, a collection of her personal papers bearing forged signatures, and several bottles containing the white powder used for systematic poisoning, all documented with the scientific precision of someone who had treated her victim's gradual incapacitation as a laboratory experiment, requiring careful observation and adjustment. Beatrice's first coherent words, spoken in a voice hoarse from days of enforced silence, confirmed the essential accuracy of Mrs. Finch's confession while adding crucial details about the psychological torture that had accompanied physical imprisonment, including threats that resistance would result in immediate death and claims that the household believed she had eloped with Captain Whitmore, creating the impression that rescue was impossible because no one would think to search for someone presumed to have left voluntarily. Her account revealed that Mrs. Finch had attempted to force her signature on documents transferring significant portions of the estate to various charities under the companion's administrative control, a scheme that would have provided legal access to Maplewood Hall's resources while maintaining the appearance of philanthropic generosity designed to deflect suspicion from someone systematically looting an inheritance through forged authorizations and manufactured mental incapacity. The emergence from the wine cellar into afternoon sunlight carried symbolic weight as Inspector Slack's official arrest of Dorothy Wainwright, alias Mrs. Dorothy Finch, brought justice to a case that had revealed disturbing truths about the vulnerability of isolated women with inherited wealth to predators who could assume positions of trust while concealing criminal intentions behind facades of respectability and devoted service. Captain Whitmore's immediate vindication brought relief tempered by quiet bitterness at having been so readily suspected, while the discovery in Mrs. Finch's room of masculine disguise, practiced signatures, Graves' missing keys, and the remainder of the poisonous powder provided tangible proof of the elaborate conspiracy that had masqueraded as household efficiency and loyal companionship for months of patient criminal preparation. The revelation transformed the gentle village atmosphere as news spread through St. Mary Mead with the swiftness that accompanied truly shocking scandals, leaving residents to grapple with the unsettling truth that malice had operated from within trusted circles rather than through external criminal enterprise. While Lionel Pembroke faced the collapse of his own ambitions with genuine shame that his vanity and financial desperation had provided convenient cover for Mrs. Finch's more serious crimes. Miss Marple, observing the various reactions with her characteristic blend of compassion and clinical interest, reflected that the case had once again demonstrated how ordinary human failings, greed, envy, and distorted entitlement could flourish behind masks of respectability until accumulated inconsistencies finally betrayed even the most carefully constructed deceptions to those trained in reading the subtle language of guilt and desperation that announced itself through gesture, expression, and the small betrayals that revealed character more clearly than any formal confession. As Maplewood Hall began its slow return to tranquility under Beatrice's grateful but shaken management, Miss Marple settled her knitting more comfortably and considered how the ancient house had witnessed yet another demonstration of the eternal human capacity for both profound kindness and chilling cruelty, patterns as intricate and endlessly fascinating as any she might create with wool and needles, though infinitely more dangerous when woven by minds that had convinced themselves that desperate circumstances justified desperate measures, regardless of the innocent lives destroyed in pursuit of inheritances that would ultimately prove as ephemeral as morning mist across the peaceful English countryside. The weeks following Dorothy Wainwright's arrest brought to Maplewood Hall the kind of gradual healing that Miss Marple had observed in other households, touched by betrayal, where recovery came not through dramatic gestures, but through the patient restoration of trust and the quiet resumption of ordinary routines that slowly rebuilt the foundation of domestic security. Beatrice's physical recovery proceeded under Dr. Haydock's careful supervision, the poison's effects gradually clearing from her system as her natural resilience reasserted itself. Though Miss Marple noted with compassionate understanding that the young woman's eyes now carried a wariness that spoke of hard-won wisdom about the masks that malice could wear within the most trusted circles of domestic life. The trial of Dorothy Wainwright proceeded with the solemn efficiency that English justice reserved for cases involving such calculated betrayal, the courtroom galleries filled with spectators drawn by the fascinating combination of inheritance intrigue and systematic deception, while the prosecution's case unfolded with devastating completeness as each piece of evidence built upon the others to create an irrefutable picture of premeditated fraud, gradual poisoning, and attempted murder disguised as devoted companionship. Captain Whitmore's vindication brought him not merely official exoneration, but also Beatrice's deepening gratitude and a renewed sense of purpose that transformed his role from suspected criminal to trusted protector, their shared ordeal having created bonds that transcended the careful professional distance they had maintained before the crisis, while his testimony about the subtle changes in Beatrice's health during Mrs. Finch's tenure provided crucial evidence of the systematic chemical manipulation designed to undermine her mental clarity and decision-making capacity. The revelation of Dorothy Wainwright's true identity as a disinherited Latham relative provided the jury with compelling motivation that explained both the elaborate nature of her scheme and the personal venom that had driven her to such extreme measures, while expert testimony about the exotic poison demonstrated a level of chemical knowledge that suggested extensive preparation and consultation with London's shadier pharmaceutical circles, painting a disturbing picture of gradual incapacitation that could have progressed to permanent brain damage or death if left unchecked. The judge's sentencing carried unusual severity as he condemned not merely the criminal acts themselves, but the violation of domestic trust that Dorothy Wainwright's deception represented, her abuse of the companion's traditional role making her crimes particularly heinous in a society that depended upon such relationships for protecting its most vulnerable members, while the sentence of life imprisonment seemed almost anticlimactic after the elaborate drama of investigation and trial, though Miss Marple reflected that justice had been served through patient accumulation of evidence rather than dramatic revelation, demonstrating once again that the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most respectable. Lionel Pembroke's chastened recognition of his unwitting role as accomplice led to genuine attempts at redemption, his vanity and financial desperation having provided convenient cover for more serious crimes. Yet his sincere efforts to support Beatrice during her recovery suggested that even weakness could be transformed into strength through honest acknowledgement of past failings and commitment to family loyalty that transcended mere self-interest. Poor Graves received the memorial that his decades of faithful service deserved, buried on a mild morning with the rector's steady voice carrying across the churchyard, while Beatrice placed white roses upon the earth and requested a small garden border to mark the spot where loyalty had paid its ultimate price for the sake of truth and justice. The establishment of a modest scholarship in his name for village apprentices, provided the kind of practical remembrance that honored his memory through helping others, while Captain Whitmore's role as pallbearer demonstrated the respect that had replaced suspicion in the household's assessment of his character and intentions, creating the foundation for relationships built upon shared trials rather than mere professional obligation or romantic attraction disguised as business efficiency. The village of St. Mary Mead absorbed the scandal into its collective memory with the resilience that characterized communities accustomed to human frailty. Though the story would undoubtedly be whispered for generations as a cautionary tale about the dangers that could lurk behind facades of respectability and devoted service, while Miss Marple observed with satisfaction that residents had learned valuable lessons about the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to examine the subtle inconsistencies that often betrayed criminal intentions to those trained in reading human nature's complex patterns. Alice's recovery from her unwitting role in the deception proceeded through nightmares and gradual acceptance, her newfound gravity suggesting that the experience had taught her to question rather than simply obey, while Cook's declaration that the girl's scones had improved provided the kind of domestic metaphor through which households announced healing without formal speeches or dramatic gestures. Beatrice's gradual return to full health coincided with her careful reconstruction of household security, changing locks and redistributing keys while establishing new procedures that balanced necessary caution with the trust required for normal domestic operation, her decisions reflecting the hard-won wisdom that kindness without prudence invited predators, while excessive suspicion poisoned the very relationships that made life worth protecting. Captain Whitmore's invitation to remain as a state manager carried implications that extended beyond professional necessity, their growing affection developing with the careful deliberation of people who had learned to value genuine feeling over romantic illusion, while Miss Marple noted with approval that their courtship proceeded through shared work and mutual respect, rather than the kind of dramatic passion that often concealed fundamental incompatibilities. As autumn settled over Maplewood Hall with its familiar cycle of harvest and preparation for winter's challenges, Miss Marple reflected that the case had once again demonstrated how ordinary human failings could flourish behind masks of respectability until accumulated inconsistencies finally betrayed even the most carefully constructed deceptions to those willing to observe patiently and think clearly about the patterns that revealed character more accurately than any formal confession or dramatic revelation. The ancient house had witnessed yet another demonstration of humanity's capacity for both profound kindness and chilling cruelty, patterns as intricate and endlessly fascinating as any she might create with wool and needles, though infinitely more dangerous when woven by minds convinced that desperate circumstances justified desperate measures regardless of innocent lives destroyed in pursuit of inheritances that would ultimately prove as ephemeral as morning mist across the peaceful English countryside, where justice and mercy continued their eternal dance through the patient work of those who understood that truth emerged not through dramatic confrontation, but through careful attention to the small details that revealed the larger patterns governing human behavior in all its complexity and contradiction. The Christmas bells of St. Mary Mead rang across frost-touched fields as winter settled over Maplewood Hall, bringing with it the kind of gentle healing that Miss Marple had observed in other households, touched by betrayal, where recovery came not through dramatic gestures but through the patient restoration of ordinary routines and the quiet rebuilding of trust that had been so carefully undermined by calculated deception. Beatrice moved through her restored home with renewed confidence, her earlier fragility replaced by a quiet strength forged through surviving systematic poisoning and elaborate manipulation, while the practical changes she had implemented spoke of hard-won wisdom about the balance between necessary caution and the trust required for normal domestic life. The locks had been changed throughout the house, keys were numbered and accounted for with military precision, and a new butler from an impeccable London agency had replaced poor Graves with the kind of transparent honesty that came from verified references and genuine character rather than the carefully constructed facade that had concealed Dorothy Wainwright's criminal intentions for so many months. Captain Whitmore's role had evolved naturally from suspected criminal to trusted protector to something more personal and permanent, their shared ordeal having created bonds that transcended professional necessity and developed into the kind of genuine affection that emerged from mutual respect and tested loyalty rather than romantic illusion or convenient arrangement. When their engagement was announced during the Christmas gathering, the news surprised no one who had observed their growing closeness, yet the joy it generated throughout the village spoke of community approval for a union that promised stability and happiness, earned through surviving deception together rather than despite it, while Beatrice's modest diamond ring caught the firelight with understated elegance that reflected her essential character beneath the complexities that inheritance had imposed upon her young life. Miss Marple noted with particular satisfaction how their courtship had proceeded through shared work and genuine compatibility rather than the kind of dramatic passion that often concealed fundamental incompatibilities, creating a foundation for marriage built upon understanding each other's strengths and vulnerabilities through actual experience rather than idealized projections. The village itself had absorbed the scandal into its collective memory with characteristic resilience, though the story would undoubtedly be whispered for generations as a cautionary tale about the dangers that could lurk behind facades of respectability and devoted service, while residents had learned valuable lessons about looking beyond surface appearances, to examine the subtle inconsistencies that often betrayed criminal intentions to those trained in reading human nature's complex patterns. Alice had been promoted to under-housekeeper, her experience with unwitting participation in Dorothy's deception having taught her to think carefully about unusual instructions and to question requests that seemed designed to circumvent normal procedures, while Cook's obvious pride in the girl's development provided the kind of domestic satisfaction that announced healing without requiring formal speeches or dramatic gestures of reconciliation and forgiveness. The establishment of a scholarship in Graves' name for village apprentices provided practical remembrance of his loyalty and sacrifice, administered through trustees who met in person and signed documents under proper supervision to prevent the kind of forgery and manipulation that had characterized Dorothy's systematic fraud. Lionel Pembroke's chastened recognition of how his vanity and financial desperation had provided convenient cover for more serious crimes led to genuine attempts at redemption, his departure for respectable employment in London marking complete rehabilitation within family circles through consistent demonstration of reformed character and renewed commitment to family loyalty that transcended mere self-interest, while his contribution to Graves's memorial fund and promise of regular correspondence suggested lessons learned through witnessing the consequences of desperate schemes and elaborate deceptions designed to circumvent legitimate inheritance procedures. Dr. Haydock's professional fascination with the systematic poisoning revealed disturbing details about the exotic compound's effects, designed to create symptoms mimicking stress-related illness, while gradually undermining cognitive function in ways that could have led to permanent brain damage or death if left unchecked, making Dorothy's crime particularly heinous in its calculated cruelty and patient implementation over months of apparent devoted service and medical care. As Miss Marple settled her knitting more comfortably during the Christmas evening's festivities, watching Beatrice and Captain Whitmore move among their guests with the easy partnership of people who had found genuine happiness through surviving trials together, she reflected that the case had once again demonstrated how ordinary human failings could flourish behind masks of respectability until accumulated inconsistencies finally betrayed even the most carefully constructed deceptions to those willing to observe patiently and think clearly about the patterns that revealed character more accurately than any formal confession or dramatic revelation. The ancient house had witnessed another cycle of betrayal and redemption, its walls holding memories of both profound kindness and chilling cruelty. Patterns as intricate and endlessly fascinating as any she might create with wool and needles, though infinitely more dangerous when woven by minds convinced that desperate circumstances justified desperate measures, regardless of innocent lives, destroyed in pursuit of inheritances that would ultimately prove as ephemeral as morning mist across the peaceful English countryside. Dorothy Wainwright's elaborate scheme had failed not through dramatic confrontation, but through the patient accumulation of small observations about Violet's scents, missing hat pins, forged signatures, and the subtle behavioral inconsistencies that announced guilt to those who understood that truth emerged through careful attention to domestic details, rather than official theories about external criminal enterprise. Demonstrating once again that the most dangerous predators were often those who appeared most respectable and trustworthy within the intimate circles of family and household service. The Christmas carols drifted across the restored tranquility of Maplewood Hall as Miss Marple counted her stitches and considered how justice and mercy continued their eternal dance through the patient work of those who understood that evil's defeat required not heroic gestures, but careful observation of the small details that revealed the larger patterns governing human behavior in all its wonderful and terrible complexity, where safety arrived not with trumpets, but through the right key, turning in the right lock, the proper spoon in the proper drawer, and the blessed ordinariness of an English village Christmas where cocoa made one sleepy for entirely innocent reasons.